Welcome to the Hippodrome of Alexandria. The main hippodrome of the city was called the Legeon, in honor of Lagos, the ancestor of the Ptolemies. Alexandrians were great lovers of horse racing. They were fascinated by the rivalry of these races, the agon, as it was said at that time, that every competition brought. It was a struggle for glory.
You can see exactly how it's situated. Pretty impressive.
The most important chariot race was the Tethrypon. Using 4 horses with the quickest harness to the front right, the charioteer would race for 12 laps, with sharp turns at either end of the hippodrome. The victors were crowned with garlands of olive and received prize money, but the most sought-after reward was to be acclaimed by the works of poets, such as Callimachus and Pindar.
So that you would be remembered, you and your family.
Ye hymns that rule the lyre, what god, what hero, aye, and what man shall we loudly praise? Verily Zeus is the lord of Pisa, and Heracles established the Olympic festival, while Theron must be proclaimed by reason of his victorious chariot with its 4 horses. Theron, who is just in his regard for guests, and who is the bulwark of Akragas, the choicest flower of an auspicious line of sires, whose city towers on high, bringing wealth and glory to crown their native merits.
Fairly simple design. Might be able to climb up there even with this character. Oops, meant to do something different. It's pretty amazing. You could put perfume on those things right there to help with the scent too. On those covers. Well, awnings, I guess you could call them.
Έκνον δι πληγίνει αυτής πάλι.
Maybe you can climb.
Σάλμα δε αυτής πάλι. Τι χειρεμ τον μένα.
Oops.
Αυτής πάλι πεπραγμένα φαύλατε και διεφθαρμένα. Πάυσε του δοχή. Αν δυνάμει πατάξιν αυτούς, οψωρία μου.
Trying to remember if you could climb it in the game too. I don't remember if I tried to climb this one. I think I did, but might not be able to do it here. Let's switch to the next one. Trying to go through each one of these as a different character.
Welcome to the Islands of Ferris. The Heptastadion was a bridge-like causeway connecting the island of Ferris to mainland Alexandria. Its name is based on the Greek terms of measurement, hepta, meaning 7, and stadion, which is a measure of length of roughly 180 meters.
And you can see the bridge right there. With the lighthouse. Not that far away.
Since its construction would separate the Grand Port to the east and the port of Eunostos to the west, it was designed with channels at each end. These openings allowed passage from one port to the other.
Thinking ahead.
Along with creating separate harbors for the commercial and military shipping, the causeway served as a main aqueduct for the island's inhabitants. Its presence also helped protect the island and its ports from rough wind and sea currents. At the end of antiquity, the Heptastadion disappeared under layers of silt and soil, which formed an important sedimentary deposit. While the Serapeum was the most celebrated of the temples in Alexandria, many other temples were built within the city. Most of these structures have been completely erased over time, and there is no way to discern how many existed. However, research of ancient papyri offer tantalizing hints as to the possible location of at least some of the temples. Both papyri and coins reveal evidence of many temples built for the gods. Poseidon, the god of the sea, likely had an edifice in his honor west of this island, as well as on the mainland. This temple next to you is dedicated to Isis Feria, the divine protector of the lighthouse. This location hosted annual celebrations in the month of April, known as the Sacrum Feria, in connection to the lighthouse. In her incarnation as Isis Fortuna, the goddess carries a rudder and a cornucopia, both symbols of good luck for navigators.
Which would be very important for a port city. So it's no surprise that she and Poseidon will be honored here. Especially with the Greek connections up at the Ptolemies and the Greek connections to the city itself.
Considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Lighthouse of Alexandria was a source of great pride for the inhabitants of the city. Construction began under Ptolemy I's reign and lasted 15 years. It was completed during his son's rule. Once completed, the lighthouse was dedicated to the gods for the salvation of those who sail the sea. Built on the island of Pharos, the stone structure was 3 tiers set on top of one another in a step formation. The second floor consisted of an octagonal tower, and the top floor was a cylindrical tower topped by a statue. The interior provided space for staff rooms and a ramp which allowed the transport of fuel to the upper floors.
Which is why it's the wonder of the world. It is impressive.
Essential to safe navigation through the rifts and shallow waters, the Pharos was a functioning lighthouse with a beam reportedly visible 50 kilometers away. It's unclear what kind of fuel was used or how much. Any other details of how the light worked remain a mystery.
It's a shame that so much information was lost, such as this right here. It's probably good speculation about how it worked. It's just no way to know exactly how they did it any longer. And the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the Great Library in Alexandria, didn't really help that matter either.
For several centuries, the Pharos was one of the highest monuments ever built by man. It measured roughly 110 meters in height, compared to the Pyramid of Giza, which was around 140 meters tall. Gradually, the structure was eroded by earthquakes, and then completely destroyed in 1480 CE, when a fort was built over it. Archaeological excavations on the seabed have uncovered many blocks from the ancient building.
Coin with the lighthouse pressed on it. Oops. Should be able to climb it like the regular game. I believe. Might be too much. I'll go that way. Ooh, that's... Fortunately, you don't get injured. That's good. And that's how I'll get in. The fuel will be brought up this ramp right here. Imagine going up this every day to bring fuel to the place. Each of these with rooms around the outside of it. For storage, I imagine they had people living in here too. And you can even see a lot of the detail that they put into this building, which is very impressive. A lot of it's repeatable, but nonetheless impressive. Kind of reminds me of Nike and her sisters. This is one good way to explore this place without being attacked. Or even having to worry about it. So you can synchronize here too. It is an impressive view. So that was the Egyptian nobleman, switching to noblewoman now. And some of this I'm doing to show off the models. So I've completed Alexandria. Next I'll probably see where these are. Green Mountains and up yonder.
Welcome to Osiris, the first mummy.
It's interesting to note how funeral practices change over time, as many other practices change. And Scorpion.
The oldest mummies recovered date from the Old Kingdom, though Egyptologists believe that mummification was in use much earlier than that. At first, the body was mummified through environmental desiccation, by leveraging the dryness of the environment and the heat of the climate. Early experimentations in mummification were conducted with the use of resin made from tree sap. Strips of linen were only used on some superficial parts of the epidermis of the hands or jaw. Ideologically, the will to preserve the body is not explained in any way until 3600 BCE. This is when the Egyptian belief that the body housed the soul was finally documented for modern Egyptologists to eventually decipher. It was not until the arrival of the myth of Osiris in the Egyptian religion around the 5th dynasty that mummification was thoroughly conceptualized. The practice was thereafter grounded in both a mythological and ideological point of view. Osiris was mainly known as the god of the dead and the god of resurrection. The most well-known Genesis myth concerning Osiris is that of his dismemberment. It is Plutarch who gives the most simplified and complete summary of the story. Within Egyptian mythology, Osiris represented the first king to rule Egypt. Jealous of his power, his brother Seth attempted to usurp his throne. After several unsuccessful attempts, Seth succeeded in killing his brother by dismembering him and scattering the pieces of his body all over Egypt. Isit, the Great of Magic, traveled all over Egypt in search of the pieces of her husband's body. After a long search, she recovered all the pieces save for his manhood, as it was eaten by a fish. Isit then reassembled the body of her husband by binding it together with strips of linen. Aided by her sister Nephthys, another powerful magician, they gave Osiris the breath of life. This not only brought him back from the dead, but also allowed him to recover his virility long enough to impregnate Isit, thus ensuring his succession before, once more, dying. Thus Horus was born. The ritual used to bring Osiris back to life essentially depicts how he became the first mummy. It is why, on the sarcophagi of kings, we often find Isit and Nephthys represented as the magicians who restore life to the deceased.
It also explains a little bit about the view of the afterlife and why they're mummified. The tours aren't long, but they are pretty interesting. Siwa's not too far away. Switching to an actor now. Next, Memphis.
Welcome to Mummies of Ancient Egypt.
I think this will go over the mummification
The
process.
mummification process used
Yep.
by ancient Egyptians was highly ceremonial in nature. The different types of mummification took into account the social level and richness of the deceased and even included animals. The most expensive was that reserved for the pharaoh and the royal family, as well as some of the wealthiest members of the court.
Also, it happened to cats a lot.
The first step was cleaning. Once bodies arrived at the mummification site, they were placed on inclined tables while the bodily fluids drained away. They were then cleansed by priests until they were deemed ready for the purification process. The purification of the body began with a libation from sacred water. The priest then fumigated the body with terebinth resin. After the ritual cleansing, priests used oils, spices, and all kinds of essences to further purify the body of the deceased. Finally, all body hair was meticulously removed. Once the body was properly purified, embalmers removed the organs, following very specific procedures. First, the brain was extracted by inserting a spoon through the nostril to break the ethmoid bone. Then, using a spatula, the pieces of the brain were removed as thoroughly as possible. What matter remained was extracted after a process of liquefaction, achieved through the use of a caustic liquid. The cranial box, once emptied, was rinsed and disinfected with palm wine, and then stuffed with strips of linen cloth and liquefied resin. After taking care of the brain, embalmers made an incision on the left flank and carefully set aside the viscera. The inside of the body was also rinsed with palm wine. Then the embalmers filled the belly with pure myrrh, cinnamon, and other perfumes, and sewed it shut. The removed viscera were washed in palm wine and packed in crushed herbs before being placed in canopic jars. Canopic jars were placed close to the sarcophagus or kept in a chest nearby. At first, the viscera were wrapped in tissue and placed in the vases. As the ritual requirements became more elaborate, ointments, spices, and even water and natron were added to the process.
You see some of this in the Mummy movie. The various vases that the characters picked up and that the mummy needed to get back were his organs.
Towards the middle of the New Kingdom, canopic jars assumed the appearance of the four sons of Horus. They were known as the protectors of the viscera. These protectors had their own guardians, each a goddess of the dead. Imseti, the human-headed god, protected the liver and was protected by the goddess Iset. Hapi, the baboon-headed god, protected the lungs and was protected by the goddess Nephthys. Dumut-Ef, the jackal-headed god, protected the stomach and was protected by the goddess Neith. And finally, Qebehsenuef, the falcon-headed god, protected the intestines and was protected by the goddess Selket. Natron is a naturally occurring mineral found in evaporite. These sedimentary rocks are made up of mineral salts and were generally mined from lake beds in Egypt.
This becomes an important story point in the main story.
Embalmers used natron as a desiccant to dry the flesh and stop the corpse's putrefaction process. Once the body was cleansed and eviscerated, the deceased was covered in natron for about 40 days. Once desiccated, the body was prepared to be wrapped in strips of linen. Once the body was fully desiccated by the natron treatment, embalmers oiled, painted, and sometimes even added hair extensions or a wig. They often used a henna-based antiseptic preparation to give the body a more colorful and lively appearance while preparing it to resist molds and fungi. Next came the phase which gave mummies their most well-known appearance, the wrapping. Originally, each part of the body was wrapped separately. Men had their arms crossed on their chests, while women had the right arm folded over their breasts and the left arm stretched along the body. However, techniques evolved over time. Eventually, the body as a whole was wrapped with limbs alongside the body, and increasingly sophisticated and different techniques of weaving flax bands were developed. In addition to the jewelry and amulets arranged on the skin of the deceased, amulets were also carefully inserted into the weaving of the linen strips. Each amulet was linked to a myth, or to an ideological belief related to rebirth.
It's amazing how many are tied to rebirth. And how many rebirth legends and myths there are. All over the place.
Masks were an important part of a mummy's finery. Early wooden funeral coverings were very expensive, however, and soon replaced by masks created through a technique known as cartonnage. Masks fashioned with this method were created by laying several layers of linen or papyrus pulp on a base made of mud or straw. Cartonnage was used for more than funerary masks. Ornaments and the animal coffins of the late period were also made in such a fashion. Cartonnage evolved to cover the entire body of the mummy during the 22nd dynasty. The mummies were placed on a board inside a rigid envelope of cartonnage, which was laced at the back with a string. Extremely cost-effective and visually pleasing, this technique was very popular through all layers of the society.
And this is probably what a lot of people are mostly used to and seeing or thinking of mummies.
Cartonnage envelopes were usually covered with inscriptions and polychrome decorations, specifying the names and titles of the deceased, scenes depicting daily life, or decorations specific to the funerary world. This was a true gift for Egyptologists eager to study the funerary rites of the ancient Egyptians.
A way to tell their story.
Once the mummy was properly wrapped and adorned, the embalmers proceeded with the ceremony of the opening of the mouth. A vital step of the funerary process, this ceremony was meant to bring back to life the deceased themselves, or an object representing the deceased. There were no less than 75 different stages for the opening of the mouth. It required the application of the same oils, ointments, spices, and perfumes used during the mummification process. Makeup was sometimes part of the process as well. The last stage of this long ritual was the act of touching the mouth with the adze to symbolically allow the breath of life to infuse an inert body. Its performance was reserved for a very specific set of people: priests who wore the mask of the god Anubis, a close relative of the family, or by the heir to the throne.
And you can see a wooden sarcophagus right here. For the completed process right here. That again, a lot of people are familiar with. Probably most familiar with. Switch into this one now. This is a tragic one. Going up here. Actually, both of these two are pretty tragic. Next, Lake Mario. I'm not very good at pronunciation sometimes.
Welcome to The Importance of Mummies. The first hieroglyph for embalmer appeared in pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom. It is likely that embalming was a trade that progressed alongside the evolution of ancient Egyptian funeral practices. While we still know nothing of how embalming came to be a profession, we do know that embalmers had a hierarchy, and that each embalmer specialized in a specific phase of the mummification process.
Oh, a cat. You can interact with them too if you just duck down, and sometimes you'll pet them. It might not happen in this one. But Bayek, if you go into stealth mode, will pet the cat most of the time.
The mummification techniques were jealously guarded by embalmers from generation to generation. Despite their efforts, Herodotus and Diodorus discovered their methods in late antiquity, but historians were skeptical about the validity of the texts. It remained a mystery until two teams of modern medical legal scientists confirmed the process in 1994 and again in 2011. The Uabet, meaning the pure place, was where the embalmers mummified the bodies of the deceased. Until the end of the Middle Kingdom, it was located in tents at the edges of the city due to the smell of decomposition. In the New Kingdom, however, the Uabet was located within the city limits, though still in open-air spaces. In the same way that the practices and techniques of mummification evolved, so possibly did consideration towards embalmers within ancient Egyptian society.
Especially when such a process requires a lot of training.
The pharaoh had access to the most elaborate of mummification rituals. The richer citizens of Egypt also enjoyed complex embalming options, though none of them allowed for the removal of the brain or viscera. After purifying the body, embalmers injected a liquid through the rectum, sealed it, and allowed the mixture to settle. They then plunged the body into natron for up to 40 days. Once the body was dried, the seal was removed, and the entrails flowed out with the injected liquid, leaving the skin and bones of the deceased to be wrapped in linen and returned to the family for burial. The least costly embalming option was for the embalmers to simply inject a product called surmaya and immerse the body in the natron for up to 40 days before handing it over to the family. For all those who could not afford any embalming process, desert burials offered a pauper's alternative to preserve the bodies of the dead. Egyptian civilization has always appealed to Westerners, even before the Greek and Roman invasions. As early as the Middle Ages, mummies discovered by travelers were often sent back to Europe. Curio cabinets, dating from the 16th and 17th centuries, usually included pharaonic artifacts in their collections.
Probably just doesn't have the animation for it.
The Egyptomania phenomenon was heralded by Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian campaign, which lasted from 1798 to 1802. The following years were marked by a resurgence of interest from rich enthusiasts and scholars who exposed Egypt to the general populace. Many research societies focusing on Egyptology were founded during those years. By 1868, mass tourism began in Egypt under the aegis of the Cook Agency. The rich would indulge in leisure trips to Egypt and bring back mummies. Upon their return, they would organize evenings that consisted of unpacking mummies and removing strips of linen and amulets layer by layer. These were considered the shining cultural events of the season. The Egyptian collections of many a museum were founded as a consequence of this mass pillaging. Thanks to those dubious parties, the fantasy of a mummy coming back to life, seeking revenge on its defilers, was born. The mummy malediction myth has remained steady in popular culture ever since, particularly in written media and cinema.
Which is pretty much every mummy movie you've seen. Rita's a pretty mysterious and interesting character. You see him pretty much everywhere. He's the one who gives you daily quests.
Κυριαίων γίνεων τέχε άνερον, τούτου γέο φελούνε ημών. Ήγαρ χρήσε.
Welcome to Amulets and Rituals.
Πολύλετε ότι προσήγουν πάνι. Τέληκε και να διαπαντούσιαν αγάθεν εισιδούνε τας μετρεπόλεως, τετρακίσαν τα μερίες ενεργούτε. Διαδεσίκιαν μακράν έσετε γε.
Oh, so that's what they are. Or places where you can interact. That is kind of neat.
αμαξιτών γε αγγελεύσματος. Αριστόδικος γε
Near the Mediterranean.
Τριών ουν νεογούν κάμιλοντε και τετρακίσων όλων αποδώστε βούλητε. Ου απολύτεστε γάρ των καιρών. Πάντα όνια κράτης τα ίσισε.
Τα αγαθά ηγόρασο παρά το πολιτήριο, μετά πολύ μου χθήνε, ιώστε και κόρη αυτού,
Εκείκο ουν εμπορέοι. Πρόρησης
I
παρούσου
think they're speaking in Greek.
νοτιέδος μελίσσονται. Ουσίτε εκεί εν ενδοτέρο πράγμαση διέπιν δεινών, και ενδένο γε ίστατο εις εγγύτατο.
And on one of those
Κάλιον
things,
διμερό εν φευξίνε, από